Again, everyone, this is our third and last Sober for the Holidays webinar. And this week we have Lana joining us, Lana Seiler. Seiler. I've worked with Lana about 5 years. We worked together at a previous place, but I still can't say her last name right. And but she's an LCSW. She's a primary therapist, and she is, you know, if you obviously, since you're on this call and you know Lana, you know that she's awesome, and she's really going to dig into the trauma aspect and her topic, you know, right, healing for the holidays and healing psychologically and what that looks like, you know, and she's just going to dive into it. And you know, I'm kind of excited for it because I've known Lana for like 2017 or 16. So, but that being said, the Alumni Association is super pumped to continue to bring everybody these webinars. We're going to go back to our normal Wednesday night meetings next week. So if that's something that you liked and you want to get back to that, we'll be back on that course next week. I'll send out an email with all the Zoom invites and whatnot. As for this though, at the end, Lana's, you know, we're going to ask you guys if you have questions, right? So we want this to be engaging, and you know, we want the back and forth with you guys. We want to hear your questions. So again, whether it's in the chat or in the Q&A section, you know, write your question down now, write it down in the middle, write it at the end. And me and Lana will take 15-20 minutes at the end and kind of bounce around with the questions. And like I said, Alumni Association, super pumped. We got a lot of moving pieces coming up in 2022, and we're excited that you guys are hopping on, and we're excited to get Lana going here. So I'm going to take the camera off. Lana, it's all yours.
Thanks, Andy. Andy never has to feel bad about not pronouncing my name, because one time I had to introduce him and I couldn't remember who he was or what he did. Even though we've known each other for a long time. So he has like a free pass now forever. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm excited. I'm going to share my screen. You guys are going to have to bear with me while I figure this out. Here we go. Looks like it's working. Hold on a second. Okay. We're going to do slideshow. Start. Okay. Look at that. So I'm going to talk a little bit before I dive in about why I picked this topic. Sober for the holidays, healing for the holidays. I get this question a lot from people, and so I thought I would take the time to answer it in sort of a in-depth and methodical way to the degree that I can. A lot of people ask these types of questions, like, what does it mean to heal? And I think, you know, when we are at certain times of the year, especially around holidays, and with family members or, you know, family friends, there can be a lot of triggering situations that come up. Even without the family component, sensory cues are pretty powerful. And so, you know, feeling the temperature change in the air and seeing decorations up in stores and, you know, all of these things that remind us of a certain time of year can bring us back pretty easily and pretty powerfully to that same time last year or 2 years ago or 5 years ago or 25 years ago. And so it's a time for us to be maybe a little more aware of our own activations and triggers, so that we can get what we want to get out of the holiday season, be able to enjoy it more with our loved ones, and the new year coming up, because that's really what we're looking at is New Year's and New Year's Eve coming up, and you know, be able to kind of start the year off on a good foot. And also, you know me, I always talk about trauma activation and triggers being a window and an opportunity, but we'll talk much more about that. What does it mean to heal? So this is theory and conceptualization. And I want to touch on that for a moment, because this isn't a hard science, right? So we're going to talk about a lot of stuff, and well, I'm going to talk about a lot of stuff, and you know, there isn't going to be necessarily, you know, a part of the brain or a specific scientific fact that I can point to back all of this up, although I do have some neuroscience stuff in there to back some of it up. But really what I'm hoping to do today is to work on helping conceptualize, because if we can conceptualize this stuff for ourselves, it's easier for us to go through a healing process. And I know this webinar or event is for alumni and lodge people, so current people. So this is helpful for both anywhere you are in your journey. So even if you've already been to treatment once, twice, 3 times, or this is your very first time and just kind of opening up to the idea of therapy and healing, this is good information, because refining your conceptualization of these things and understanding can only help. And for those of you who are alumni, my hope is that you're in some type of outpatient therapy or treatment, and this can be really helpful for that too. So here we go. Can I really heal? What does it mean? What does therapy really do? How do I cope? These are questions that I get a lot. I'm sure people have, had them bouncing around in their heads, because we throw around a lot of terms as clinicians and in treatment and in therapy. We throw around a lot of these, like, oh, well, it's part of your journey and it's your process and it's your healing. And sometimes I feel like, we have to just kind of take a step back and be like, what does this actually mean? I've been doing a lot of thinking about this over the years. And one of the ways that I found to be helpful to conceptualize this process is thinking about an injury concept and a disease concept for psychological conditions. And I know there's a lot of talk around in the rooms and in substance use treatment about the disease concept of addiction, and there's been some back and forth and different schools of thought. But if we look at it sort of under a broader umbrella, most of what we look at psychologically in terms of maladaptive processes, behaviors, thought patterns, when we break out that DSM and look at diagnoses and all that stuff, we kind of are operating under sort of a disease model, because we're operating loosely under the medical model. So the reason I add injury and disease is because I have found that it can be helpful to make a distinction when we're looking at trauma specifically. Some of that can be categorized, I think, as psychological injury. Because it's event-based. It's something that came out of a specific thing happening, or something happening over a long period of time, rather than something that's more of a, pre-existing condition neurochemically. So that's just something to think about. We'll talk a little bit more about it. Both of these conceptualizations can have chronic elements that need to be managed. And both have elements that can be reduced or mitigated, like in some cases, almost taken away completely to a level that doesn't interfere with quality of life. So I'm not trying to say that if it's a psychological injury, it can be cured. If it's a disease, it can't, or vice versa. I think both have both qualities to them. And it's important to look at that so that we can do the most to make life, better, more enjoyable, more productive. And like with anything, in medicine, we're always looking at an interplay of biology, genetic vulnerabilities, and things like that with environmental factors. I think it's safe to say that the nature versus nurture argument has been settled long ago, and we know that it's both. I was doing some research for this presentation. And what was interesting was I was looking for like any kind of quick, easy definition of, what constitutes an injury versus what constitutes a disease. And what kept popping up were these workman's comp websites that had legal definitions. So I thought that was interesting, and I kind of just pulled. So I cited, T. White Esquire there, the person who had written these particular ones on the website that I found. But I just wanted something that is, again, kind of easy to conceptualize, brief. I don't want to, take forever on this, but generally we're looking at injury as something that has occurred by way of an accident or an event, kind of like I alluded to before. Disease is a condition of gradual onset, having developed over a period of time. And both these definitions, even on the workman's comp website I was looking at, which cracks me up every time I say that, because it's like, oh, you weren't looking at WebMD. But anyway, both of them apply to physical and psychological conditions. I even cited where I got this from. But anyway, so again, this is conceptualization, right? We're looking at a way to understand healing that can make sense so that we can have a more mindful process through our healing journey. So when we think about it like this, it can help us to kind of look at the trajectory or the landscape of our road ahead in healing. So when we look at an analogy of physical wounding, which I tend to use a lot when I'm working with patients who are beginning work on their trauma, I'm kind of leaning in the direction initially of the injury concept. And we look at what happens with a physical wound, right? So sometimes, even when we have a physical wound, like a cut or a break or a sprain, wounds need an intervention of some kind to heal without getting infected or without having, secondary injury or secondary conditions forming. And that answers the question, what happens if no intervention is given? So if you have a big cut that needs stitches, but you don't get stitches, you could have an infection, you could end up having a scar. So it kind of gives us a little bit of a visual, way to understand therapy is an intervention in the same way or in a similar way that stitches might be, or appropriate medicine might be. What about scarring? We often have scars, right, from physical injuries. And I would say that we often have scars from psychological injuries also. Scars do indicate that some healing has happened, and we can talk a little bit more about what that looks like. I put a note here, not the same as structural brain damage, because I realized that I was talking a lot about like injury and disease, and it might be correlating to like actual brain damage. So that isn't always the case, although there are some changes, or I guess you could say injury to our brains in terms of structural and circuitry issues that can happen from prolonged high stress environments. Okay, so I'm not going to read all these because you guys can read them yourselves, but this is just a bit about neurobiological considerations. The first paragraph is talking about neuroplasticity and regeneration. And the concept of neuroplasticity is really an important one in therapy and in behavioral health, because it lets us know that, and this is not new, although it's, in the last, I guess, 30 years or so, that our brains are not fixed after a certain age and stuck, that our brains are able to change. We can grow new neural networks and pathways, and we can increase our brain's ability to function optimally, even after years of maybe having maladaptive thought patterns, right? So it can feel like we're really stuck, but the reality is we aren't. Neurogenesis is possible. In this particular first little blurb here, what I pulled from that in bold here is, in other words, a change in state from survival to social engagement increases neuroplasticity and the brain's ability to heal. So this is talking about when we move from chronic stress states, which keep us kind of stuck in a fight or flight freeze, into more of homeostasis and social engagement, which is brain network that can, sorry, there's something happening and I want to make sure. Okay. It said that hopefully you could see my screen the whole time. That can pull us out of that survival mode into social engagement, which activates brain networks that are much more conducive for learning new things, neuroplasticity, which is great. It's great news. So there's that. Then just underneath here, it's talking a bit about some of the things that can happen, right? And this isn't meant to be a downer. This is just meant to kind of let us know that this is real. PTSD is real. Chronic stress conditions are real. The stress they put on our brains and bodies is significant. I've heard it described kind of like it being in a car, having your foot on the gas and the brake at the same time. It just kind of like really puts it puts some strain on the hardware, you know, when we're in these chronic states of trauma activation, which we can be in and not even realize because we're so used to it. So yeah, I'm sure you guys can read all that. It's just a little bit of the neuroscience behind what can happen and changes in the brain. Intervention. So what is intervention? I'm on the right slide here. Let me just make sure. Yes. Yep. Okay. Intervention is some form of treatment. So in medicine, interventions are usually psychopharmacological, pharmacological, maybe, you know, orthopedic, whatever. And in psychology, our interventions are psychopharmacological and therapeutic for the most part. Also things like deep TMS. Okay, I just froze for a second. There we go. If wounding is too profound to heal naturally, so back to that injury sort of conceptualization, and in the case of trauma, it would be surpassing our ability to cope, so overwhelming our ability to cope, then we may need intervention to mitigate long-term symptoms, and long-term symptoms for trauma can look like PTSD. And even if we do get intervention and we do have some healing, we can still have some psychological scarring. And what I mean by that is reminders of the event. This can include negative associations, ongoing difficulties with intimacy. The scarring response, though, is less intense and interferes less with quality of life. So it may be, I'll just make it a little more real. Let's say in this holiday season, you've done a ton of work on your relationship with your sibling, right? And there's been trauma in the past with your sibling. You know you're going to see your sibling when you go home to see your family for Christmas or New Year's or whatever holiday you celebrate. Oh, people are asking me to turn up my sound. I don't know if this is better, but I just turned it up. And let's say you've done all this work on that relationship. And so when you go visit your family and you see your sibling, you may not have the same, you hopefully won't have the same type of response to them that you would have if you hadn't done any work on it. So you may not have a trauma reaction. You may not need to like leave and ground and regulate, but you may still have something, right? There may still be an association, a memory, a thought that comes up, a feeling that's much less intense and manageable. So that's what I mean by kind of carrying these scars with us. Healing doesn't necessarily mean that it's absolutely gone. It means that we're at a level that's manageable, and we may just experience some reminders of things that have happened in the past. Borrowing from Ryan Suave, Andy will know who I'm talking about, one of my mentors. His way of describing this sort of concept is, like if we have a leg injury that heals, we have a limp. The limp is our ongoing relationship with the leg injury. The leg injury is already healed. Trauma symptoms are our ongoing relationship with the traumatic events. Okay, equanimity. I like this part. So what are we looking for, right? A definition of equanimity that I liked is an evenness of mind, especially under stress, having consistency and balance with regard to response reactions. That came from Webster's. So, and this one also, an even-minded mental state or dispositional tendency toward all experiences or objects, regardless of their affective valence, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral source. And I cited where I got that from. It's the sense that we have some agency of our internal state, regardless of what may be happening in our lives outside. So it gives us a little more power and a little more self-control or sense of self-control, in that things may be unpleasant or they may be pleasant, but regardless of that, we are able to have some sort of balance, some harmony, some consistency internally. And then, I kind of tie this in with the concept of homeostasis, which I mentioned earlier. In medicine and physiology, they look at homeostasis as the self-regulating process by which an organism can maintain internal internal stability while adjusting to changing external conditions. So you can see how that's sort of similar conceptually. And I like to use those two together because we are all looking for homeostasis naturally, in the same way that a plant or flower is going to kind of lean toward the source of sunlight, in the same way that our bodies are going to use our white blood cells to fight off infection and disease and to heal our wounds. In the same way that we have all these natural processes that are moving toward healing, moving toward balance, we as an organism are wholly moving toward that also, and or trying to. And that applies also to psychological trauma and anything that you're trying to heal from. Resourcing. So resources are tools we can use to increase our resilience, equanimity, and remain in a homeostatic state emotionally. So I like to really kind of dig into this because when you're in therapy, when you're in treatment, a lot of what we're doing is throwing things at you like, oh, here's DBT, here's CBT, here's grounding, here's all this stuff. And we know, right, we're throwing you resource tools, but until there's a way to kind of conceptualize it, sometimes it's hard to understand how all this stuff fits together. But when we're looking at finding this homeostatic state, when we're looking at healing our injuries, psychological injuries and struggles, these tools, emotion regulation, distress tolerance, those are both DBT, grounding and centering techniques, psychopharmacologically, so medicine, medication, all these things are tools to help us achieve this equanimity, to achieve this homeostasis. Well-resourced individuals, so people who have a good bucket of tools for resourcing and know how to use them and do use them, because there's, of course, the difference between having them, knowing how to use them, and then actually implementing them in our lives. But well-resourced people are able to navigate trauma work and remain in a window of tolerance. And this is important because that's critical for you to be able to move forward in your trauma work with any therapist, is that you're able to resource internally. Well-resourced people experience self-efficacy, are able to remain in social engagement. And these are all things that really kind of point toward healing and positive change. So now I want to talk just a little bit about symptom management and symptom reduction. Again, these are conversations that I have with people because I get asked questions like, is this going to get better? Will this go away? Or am I just going to have to deal with or cope with these symptoms? Hold on. I don't have a meeting ID. Okay, hopefully you guys can hear me. Let me know if anyone else is really having a hard time hearing me. So symptom management is when we do have to sort of deal with or continue to deal with the symptoms that we're experiencing, whether it's depression, anxiety, nightmares, flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, intrusive images, high startle response, all these different symptoms, cravings for substances. So we give you these tools like DBT, grounding, all this stuff to help you manage, right, and reduce the intensity of these symptoms, which is symptom reduction. So in reducing symptoms and eliminating them if possible, we're usually looking at a mix of things, including symptom management techniques, as well as, in the case of trauma, re-experiencing modalities. And both of those together can do sort of what we think of, I think, when we think about what healing looks like or means. And then I want to talk a little bit about what reconsolidation is in terms of trauma. So right now I'm kind of narrowing it down and moving out of like general mental health and behavioral health, including addiction stuff, and kind of focusing in on trauma work. Reconsolidation is when you work with a therapist and you utilize re-experiencing modalities and methods in order to revisit traumatic experiences from a resourced emotional state within the window of tolerance. This works by allowing us to access this emotionally charged material in a way that's activating enough to open the door to change, because we have to kind of we have to activate ourselves enough that we're not just completely disconnected from the memory, but not so much that we're outside of a window of tolerance. And I'll talk a little bit about what a window of tolerance is just briefly. That's where we are able to stay in a relatively resourced place. So we're not finding ourselves totally in trauma reaction, either on the up-regulated side, meaning in like hypervigilance and panic and anxiety, or on the opposite end of the spectrum, which looks like dissociative, shutdown, totally disconnected. So that's a spectrum. On either side of the extremes, we're out of a window of tolerance. Within our window of tolerance, at the edges, and here I wrote, as said in yoga classes, growth happens at our edges, meaning we're not going to be right in the middle where we're totally comfortable. We're going to move toward the edges of our window of tolerance, either a little on the hyper activated side or hypo activated side, but we're not falling out of that window. Okay, so that's really where re-experiencing is effective. When we engage in the re-experiencing methods, we can view the incidents with our whole mental and emotional capacities. And what that means is we're not in a trauma reaction. When that happens, when we're out of our window of tolerance, a lot of times executive function doesn't work that well. We end up more kind of trapped in our limbic system and our emotion mind kind of gets overwhelmed. Autonomic nervous system really kind of takes over. So we don't want that. We want to be able to experience it with our whole mental and emotional capacities. So everything online. Understanding, with the understanding and perspective of our current self. And I put that in bold because if we're able to be in our current, I'm going to share my age, which still can't believe that I'm 41. My 41-year-old self sees things very different than my 4-year-old self did. So when I'm looking, or my 14-year-old self, or my 24-year-old self. So when I'm looking at something that happened in my past from my current state, I'm able to make sense of it in a very different way. We can see what happened to us with appropriate logic and compassion. These two elements are almost always missing from a traumatized perspective. So when we think about things that have happened to us, and I hear this all the time from people, it's very rare that we can, when we're in it, and we're really feeling it and we're activated into it, to be able to look at it with logic and compassion. Most of the time, we're very self-critical, and most of the time, we're not very logical. So that's kind of an overview of, this kind of elusive idea or concept of like trauma therapy and healing and like the nuts and bolts and mechanics of it. And then I wanted to just touch on this memories issue, because a lot of what we experience in terms of symptoms are memories that feel like more like reality when they come up. And that's, it's based in some very real stuff. So again, I pulled from different things here and I cited what I could, but there's some neurological and biological theories around why this happens. Our memories get stored a little bit wonky when we're under high stress situations and when we're in fight or flight or survival mode. It doesn't just store the way, a memory of, running into your best friend at the grocery store would store. So these are just, I'm not going to go through all of this with a fine-tooth comb, but these are just some of the, theoretical ideas about why that happens. A lot of this is from Northwestern University. But what's important, I think, at the bottom here with this little bullet point is dual tasks and dual awareness, as in EMDR, which a lot of you know what that is. It's a method of trauma reconsolidation. Work to allow a controlled recall of traumatic memory while allowing memory to be stored in a less intrusive way. So in other words, it's just another way of saying, like, in some ways, in order to do some healing and to do some repair, we need to look at the things we've put away in boxes and hid up on a shelf from our current resourced adult ego state in order to make new meaning. We're meaning-making machines. So when we look at healing in like an overview, And break it down a little bit from a biological perspective, we're looking at rebalancing our autonomic nervous system. Our nervous systems get, kind of hijacked when we're in chronic stress environments, especially in early life. And our nervous systems respond to threat that may not be actual threat often, which keeps us in either a hyper-aroused or hypo-aroused state and out of social engagement. So from a biology perspective, we really need to do things like yoga, long walks in serene natural settings, breath practices, not necessarily like breath work, which can be more of an activating experience, but like the calming breath of the long exhale, things like that. And that those are ways that we can kind of work with our biology to help move healing forward. And then meaning making, like I said in the last slide, we're meaning making machines. We make meaning of the events in our lives. And based on where we are developmentally, the meaning we make out of something is going to be very different. And I see this all the time when I'm doing, child work with people. And when someone has a belief that, something that happened to them when they were young was their fault, or they could have prevented it, or that they're bad because of it, as soon as people go into some mind's eye work and get an image of themselves when they were little pulled up and connect to that emotionally, it's not that often, sometimes, but it's not that often that someone looks at that version of themselves and says, oh yeah, you're awful. Like it was totally your fault. Usually when we look at ourselves, like at 5 or 6 and get the image and our little like booties or whatever, or on the beach, chubby little babies, it's hard to say that that's the villain or that person's at fault. But when we're in our heads about it, it's easier. Another way this shows up is in group settings. I know a lot of you probably been in group. When someone else is talking about something that happened to them that's similar to what happened to you, maybe, it's easier for us to say to that other person, absolutely not. It wasn't your fault. There's nothing you could have done. You're strong, you're a survivor. Whereas to ourselves, it's a little harder. So this just kind of gives some real life examples about how our meaning making can be very different based on where we are developmentally and based off of where we are in terms of our trauma reaction. So when we're in our balanced calm state, we can make more rational meaning out of events, which can be really helpful in reconsolidation. And then neuroception, I think Porges coined this. I put that in there. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong on that. I think he did in his polyvagal theory, which really is this concept of being able, of our brains neurocepting or detecting threat and safety. And this happens very much under the hood, very much under the surface. It's not something that we're consciously aware of necessarily. Neuroception works very closely with our biology and our nervous systems, but it's good to be aware of the fact that we are, in a way, neurocepting. Our brains are on a very basic survival level, detecting constantly around us whether our environments are safe or dangerous. And when our neuroception is off because we've been conditioned to an environment that's unpredictable and unsafe, we might be over responding to what we perceive as threat, but what might not be actual threat. Okay. Moving forward. So I talked a lot about what happens in terms of how healing can come about, the nuts and bolts of it, different concepts, definitions, elements. And what I hear a lot from people too is, I just want to put this behind me and move on. So a lot of times people come into therapy, any kind of therapy, saying this right off the bat, like, how do I get over this? How do I get past this? The reality is, if we could just sort of put something in a box and move on and not have it affect us anymore, we probably would, right? It doesn't usually work that way. Moving on is usually a more involved process. However, it is possible, and moving forward really does happen. Trauma therapy and therapy in general isn't something that has to drag on forever. And being in therapy for a long time is not a bad thing. It usually changes over time. So we might be doing some pretty deep, arduous, treacherous work on difficult things for a while. And then, therapy maybe changes to like maintenance and just kind of dealing with the smaller things that come up that are triggering. It's not always this intensely difficult, painful experience kind of that we were talking about in most of this presentation. Moving forward, so what does it look like? Let's look at this a little more deeply. So resourcing and reconsolidation are part of an ongoing process, like I just mentioned, when we move on in life. When we increase the emotional depth and complexity of our new lives, triggers may arise, and that's why ongoing work is helpful. Trauma-informed, trauma-specific therapy to help us kind of navigate as our lives become more involved, as we begin to develop and create deep, meaningful relationships and jobs that are important to us, or go back to school, or re-engage in relationships with our family members and all these things. These deep interpersonal relationships and connections involve intimacy, and whether it's, romantic intimacy with friends, intimacy with your therapist, with your support groups, with your therapy group, with your peers, all of that can be powerfully healing, and it can also be triggering. So just being aware that as we grow and build and change and move into kind of what have been wanting and hoping for, we can also experience some trigger and activation from that, because it involves vulnerability, it involves risk. And just because triggers happen, or we feel a little fearful or frightened, or we get kind of activated into some old thing, it doesn't mean that the work we're doing isn't important, doesn't mean that we aren't doing the work. It just means that this is sometimes part of it and what it looks like. I like to describe these little activations that can pop up as landmines. We want to deactivate them as much as possible. We want to minimize them as much as possible. So if we do step on one, it's very weak, right? We don't want to embark on this new life in sobriety and in recovery from our mental health conditions and all this stuff with all these landmines out there. Like as soon as you see Joe from, the other neighborhood, you're going to step on a landmine and all of a sudden be activated into a whole trauma reaction. Or as soon as you hear from your stepmother, this is going to blow up. I mean, that's what we're trying to help people avoid, because that can feel very unsettling, to think that there's all these potential triggers out there that we have to keep trying to avoid. My goal for people, and I tell my clients this all the time, is that if we can reduce the amount of things you have to avoid in your life, we're doing good. I don't want you to leave treatment or leave therapy, outpatient therapy, saying, well, I can't go to Union Square, I can't go to Subway, I can't go to Susie's house, I can't see, a green coffee mug. That feels to me too restrictive for the kind of life that I think we all want. So there may be a couple things like that, but our goal in healing and moving forward is that there are less landmines, and the landmines that are still there have been deactivated to the extent that they're mild. Our trauma does not define us. The only way out is through, and that's the part that can be kind of tough, because we oftentimes want to be able to just jump over things. Moving forward looks like taking healthy risks. So getting in new relationships, taking new opportunities, engaging in new interests and hobbies. I don't know if everybody knows this, but I've shared before, I moved out here a couple of years ago, and I'm from Florida, and I started learning how to ski at 40. Talk about taking risks, and being vulnerable. I mean, almost running into herds of 4-year-olds on the bunny slope is something else, and it takes being able to tolerate risk, right? To be able to do stuff like that. And when we're in fight or flight, it's very hard for us to tolerate those risks. That happens in social engagement. We increase our tolerance for failure. We increase our ability to tolerate falling down, getting back up, looking silly, increasing our ability for spontaneity. And flexibility and compromise that may be missing when we're living in fight, flight, freeze responses. So all these things are areas where life can become much more engaging and full. Building the life we want. So no life is perfect. We're always going to be improving our ability to tolerate disappointment, no matter where we come from, no matter what walk of life we're on. We all are going to be disappointed, and we all are going to struggle in learning, how to tolerate that better. But one outcome of healing is the ability to design our lives, because before we're able to design our lives, or before we have enough energy to put into sort of creating and designing the life we want, we have to siphon some of that energy away from this constant surviving of perceived threat. Perceived threat and actual threat are two different things, and I don't think I touched on that too much, but actual threat, I think we can kind of, pretty logically understand when something is actually threatening to us. Physical danger. Emotional threat can be a little more tricky because yes, emotional violence is a real thing. Yes, we need to have good, healthy boundaries. However, we do have a little more ability for that internal protective boundary with emotional violence and emotional threat. So I would say that when we have perceived threat, a lot of it is in that area of emotional and relational, interpersonal connectedness. So what that looks like is if someone needs to confront me on something, or if I've upset somebody and they're going to set a boundary with me, and my system experiences that as an actual physical threat. Now, it's not going to be like a conscious thing. You're not sitting here thinking, oh, this person is going to come at me with a knife. But your system, your body might respond to confrontation or someone being disappointed in you or someone setting a boundary as if it's an actual threat. That's what trauma can do to us sometimes. So when I say spending too much time and energy on surviving perceived threat, what I mean is our system spends a lot of energy trying to avoid what it's perceiving as actual threat that may not be. And so if we can help our system differentiate, then we have more energy to put toward building this life that we want. So in other words, it frees us up. It allows us, healing allows us to experience life as it actually is today, not the way it would appear based off of our past. And that gives us all kinds of freedom. So again, this doesn't mean that life ends up perfect. It doesn't mean that we don't experience adversity. It means that when we do, we can address adversity for what it actually is in the present moment, rather than addressing that adversity plus the 50 other things that have happened in life that are connected to that. And we're able to see things through a more clear lens. We're able to see ourselves more accurately. We're able to see others more accurately. And I think we're able to see the world more accurately. So that's what I have in terms of healing for the holidays. And hopefully it made some sense to some of you. Hopefully you could hear me. I'm sorry that there was some problem with that. And I'll let Andy let me know if there was any questions.
Sure. Awesome. First of all, awesome job. Love it. And just a reminder, if people jumped on in the middle, if you have any questions, please add them to the comments. Something else I wanted to say in the beginning, at some point we will have, we are recording these. So if you had a friend in treatment, or if you want to just see this again in a week or whatnot, we'll be able to send them out to you guys so you can dial in a little bit more on some of the Lana slides. And so yeah, if you want this, or you know somebody that wasn't able to attend that wants this, we have it recorded and we can send it to you. So again, please write some questions. I know, Lana, as you were going, I had some questions that, again, I've known you for a long time, and I know the kind of treatment that we did at the, when we worked previously, and it's similar, it's right in line with what we're doing at APM with this trauma, and trauma is super important. And my question is kind of like, when like, I'm somebody that like, hey, I want to hey, I've been working on myself for, when I'm in treatment, I'm doing yoga, I'm doing my sessions, I'm journaling, I'm taking walks, I'm doing AA, I'm doing everything, right? and I leave and I'm on decent footing and I continue that process, but then I eventually slow down as life happens, right? A job happens, the gym happens, a relationship happens, stuff happens. I get lazy. How long does it take for the brain, like, to develop these habits? And like you said about the landmines, like once I go through, and sometimes I notice that they might come back, right? I'm moving backwards, and my trauma reactions might, where they were decent at one point, now I feel myself really spinning again. So how long does it take the brain through this process to kind of heal and get to the point? Or is it an ongoing, hey, I'm always, like you said, maintenance through the process? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Maintenance is super important. In terms of timeframes for our brains, I think it depends on a lot. It depends on, how young we were when things happened, how chronic the stress was, what our neurocircuitry is like. There's some evidence that, 60, 90 days, habits start to change and new neural pathways start to form. An analogy I like to use for neural pathways is, the ones that we've been using a lot aren't necessarily the ones that are best for us, but they're the ones that are the cleanest. It's like when you're, hiking in the forest, there's a path, a trail that's already been beaten down and created and cleared, and there's a trail that hasn't. And so, of course, those electrical impulses are going to want to go through the trail through the forest that's been beaten down because it's easier already and cleared. But what we're asking our brains to do is to send those electrical impulses down a path that has not been cleared yet, and we have to clear it. So it can feel harder, it can feel more cumbersome, or it's a little tedious. We have to keep reminding ourselves to kind of turn our mind in the direction of, the adaptive understanding and belief and framework rather than the maladaptive one. But over a time period, matter of months, usually, if it's consistent, we'll notice a big difference, and it won't be so hard. Our brains will be able to kind of naturally head down that network instead of the other one. I don't know if that answers your question, but
it does. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So again, like me and Lana said, we worked with each other and we've known each other, so we can keep talking, but we'd like to hear from you guys. And if you're in the media room, there should be an iPad to pass around. We'd love to hear. Here we go. We got one. It's a long one, so I'm going to read it. How do you know CBT being effective when someone's brain is in trauma mode? CBT seems so logical that when you are doing it well, this approach and skills set seems very helpful. However, the trauma reaction hits or you're triggered, CBT seems super unhelpful, and DBT on the other, get out of fight or flight, seems much more realistic and helpful. Then here's the question. What are the favorite sections or highlights from the Body Keeps the Score book dealing with trauma? So I know I just threw a ton at you there, Lana.
That's okay.
But it's also on your question if you want to kind of go back in, but go ahead, sink your teeth into that one.
Sure. So it's actually a great question. CBT and DBT are both helpful, and you're absolutely right. They're helpful at different times. So you aren't going to want to do, this is another therapist may say something different, because there is something called trauma-focused CBT, which I'm not quite as familiar with. But from what I know about CBT and DBT, you aren't going to do tons of complex CBT work when you're activated. When you're activated is when you're going to do the more grounding and regulating stuff like DBT, slow breathing, taking a walk, counting corners, holding something like your worry stone or whatever, these very like sensory-based, body-based, basic grounding and regulating things to help you come out of a trauma response, which is mostly biological and involving your nervous system, more so than our cognitive thoughts, right? Because it's a survival response. And you guys know this, but like, you're not, if there's like a car coming at you at 100 miles an hour, or a bear barreling at you, you're not going to be like analyzing and thinking and like contemplating. You're going to just act. And so those are the systems that are activated when we're in trauma response. So you're absolutely right. There's a time and a place for CBT. CBT is super helpful because we also walk around with all these cognitive distortions and negative core beliefs that can, in some ways, activate us into trauma responses. So when we do have moments where we're not in activation and we're able to kind of engage in CBT, that's when it is very helpful. We can kind of rework some of this stuff. Van der Kolk, I love. I'm not going to be able to quote or like go right to sections of The Body Keeps the Score. And the reason is A, I read it a long time ago, but B, I've read and listened to so much of his stuff that's outside of The Body Keeps the Score that I can't really remember what's in that book and what isn't. But he's like one of the, pioneers in this field, him and Peter Levine, who wrote Waking the Tiger. And what van der Kolk really tried to do, and what I think put him on the map, is he identified trauma and really specifically trauma therapy as something outside of the realm of just talk therapy. He started to really push hard on clinicians and on the field as a whole to say we aren't doing enough. The reason we're having poor outcomes and the reason why we keep thinking that trauma is hard to treat is because we aren't treating it in the right way. And that was brave, because he got a lot of pushback from the whole field on that. And I think he still does. He also really fought hard to get complex trauma, so early childhood trauma, its own delineation in the DSM, which didn't end up happening. But he did a lot of work that was helpful for us as clinicians who work with trauma on understanding the constellation of symptoms that come along with childhood trauma specifically, so that we can address it in a more effective way. So he, I joked with a friend of mine once. I was going to a, this is, Andy, you're going to laugh, like this just really lets you know how much of a nerd I am. I was going to a conference and van der Kolk was going to be there, and I was like, I need to have him sign my chest, like he's like a rock star in the field. And yeah, these are the things that I get all swoony about.
Nerdy, you're getting a little nerdy, but it's all right. It's passion. Yeah. It's passion. Yeah. All right, well, good. That was a great question. Anybody else? Let's dive in. Don't be shy. You mentioned adversity at one point, and I heard somebody once say, if you're in 12-step recovery, you hear, adversity will test your sobriety, right? And I was taught that doesn't really, that's not really the case. I feel like adversity will reveal your sobriety. And when I say sobriety, meaning your emotional sobriety, right? So sometimes I know in situations in my life, I'll go through a difficult situation, which used to be triggering, and I'll be like, oh shit, I handle that pretty well, surprisingly. And I find out I'm a little more sober emotionally than I thought. Then other times I go through a situation where I think I'm good and I don't handle the situation as well, right? So adversity is like a great mirror into how I'm doing with my maintenance and with my small T's kind of deal.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, there's when we are untreated, when we're walking around with those landmines, we do have kind of low resilience. It's interesting because there's that saying, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And it's not true in some cases. So yes, we all need stress in our lives. Stress is what makes us grow. It's what makes us get stronger. It's what makes us learn how to handle life. But if it's stress that's overwhelming our ability to cope at any different developmental stage in our lives, then it actually does kind of pull us back and create vulnerabilities rather than strength. So when we're untreated, we can see, oh my gosh, like the green coffee mug is like throwing me off kilter, and but like you're saying, Andy, like once you're in treatment, moving forward, doing this healing work, getting substances out of the system and out of the way, and really able to kind of gain footing, we do notice, I can see the green coffee mug is fine. Yeah. And then, before you know it, like a breakup is fine, which is, that's really activating stuff for anybody, regardless. So yeah, absolutely. Those are ways.
Like less adversity almost. The more you're doing work, all of a sudden you're like, where 10 years ago, or it's adversity everywhere you look. And now I look around and I'm like, oh, wow, I'm pretty even. Well, I'll shut up for a second because we have another question. Do you see the revision of the DSM to ever add childhood trauma as a section in the DSM? It seems like it should be included, and I don't understand why psych docs have not included it. Oh, here's you'll get into this one here. Here we go.
This is a doozy. I'm not going to jump on my soapbox.
No, get on it. Get on it.
I don't know. I think what happened was the committees and specialists and physicians and psychologists that have worked on the DSM committee. I think what their argument is that all of the constellation of symptoms that we see in childhood trauma is in there. It's just in a bunch of different places. So they didn't see the need or the benefit in adding something additionally that has that same symptomology. Of course, as clinicians and as survivors, we would like to see that, because just logically, it feels like it would make it easier for us to treat. The other thing I thought of, and this is just like Lana Seiler conspiracy theory, so don't take this with a grain of salt. I think it's hard. Childhood trauma really is, a lot of it's the result of our environment, not so much our biology. It's hard to make that into disease, the disease model, because most of the time kids are born into homes, these, fine, balanced little beings, and the environment's what creates the problems. And so that's kind of opening a can of worms, because then, does that then give us more agency and leeway to tell people how they can and can't raise their kids? And does it move the needle in what childhood trauma really is? And, a lot of us, I think, have trauma in our own histories and in our family systems. And there's a lot of, disagreement on, what constitutes childhood trauma and what doesn't. I think there's a resistance to really doing that for tons of reasons. But the actual answer that I've heard that I know of is that it's in there. It just means we have to look a little harder for it and pull from different parts of the book.
Yeah. And jumping on that too a little bit, how many conversations do you have with people, like, not quote unquote normal people, right? Or with people not in the treatment field, or somebody whose son isn't whatever. And they say, oh, trauma. And it's like, well, we've never experienced any trauma. And then it's like, the more you get into that, like that small trauma, that relational childhood trauma is everywhere, right? And I would, who the hell am I? But I would say that it's probably in most families, again, unintentionally, right? Intent, not what's that?
Impact, not intent.
Yeah, impact versus intent. But again, how do you can you talk about that, kind of the big T and the small T? Because and again, before Lana gets into that, if you have a question, please write it down. Oh, I just got one. You go on what I just said, and then we have another one.
Easy analogy for that is, if I want to do some damage to this wall,
I use it all the time, this one.
You know where I'm going. I can take a sledgehammer to it and it's going to leave a big hole. I can also take some sandpaper and stand here for 3 years, and it'll also leave just as big of a hole. So little t isn't really that little, honestly. No. That's a misconception. Yeah, it's really, it can be pretty devastating. Yeah.
Listen, I'm 38. I went home for Christmas, and I could see my little T's, because it's like I'm 11 again, right? And it's got to be that firm boundaries, and like, no, mom, and because it's like, well, hey, if you ask my mom, she just loved her son, right? But it's like, whoa, and so, I've done some work, and she did years ago, but I was like, hey, let's get back to it there, mama. But I guess that's why I live in Florida and she lives in New Jersey. So you said you can't avoid everything, but I moved, so.
Yeah, right.
Let me read this question here. It's about another book, which I'm sure you've read. Okay. It says, have you read No Bad Parts? And then she wrote another question. What advice do you have about telling your family about your experiences at APN? Like a soundbite that is authentic, but not too much info for parents or siblings, that you may not want to unpack the whole experience of treatment with.
Such good questions, you guys. Yeah. I have not read that book, No Bad Parts, although it sounds like parts work, kind of in the vein of internal family systems, which Dr. Schwartz, who created internal family systems, always says there's no such thing as a bad part, just parts with bad jobs. So if it's along those lines, I'm a total fan. Lots of good work can get done that way, and I will look it up because it sounds awesome. In terms of the family question, that's such a good one. We don't need to, drag our families through the mud with this either. Like again, there's a lot, it depends, right? And there's some instances where, there's just a lot of benefit in sitting in front of a family therapist and just having it all out and saying like, hey, this happened, that happened, I want to move forward, but I need you to know. And then there's also value, depending, right, on the situation, in doing the work with your therapist, doing the work in your mind's eye. Andy knows we do a lot of like mind's eye inner child work, something also called feeling reduction, and those types of methods. You can bring your family into the room in your mind's eye, and they don't have to be there in real life, and you can stand up for the wound, which is what it's called, stand up for the injustice and the injury, have some righteous anger about it, which can be healthy as long as we move through and don't stay stuck in the anger. And that's can be a very personal healing experience. So when we're talking to our families, especially around the holidays when we're going home or anytime we're kind of seeing them or around them, what I usually tell people is to kind of keep it I-centered. So I statements like, I was able to move through a lot of, difficult situations or difficult things that have happened in the past, and I'm, feeling a lot better about it. Instead of kind of being, you focused, which can put people on the defensive, keeping it I-based. And also just having good boundaries, like Andy's talking about. It doesn't have to be like miles and miles of physical boundary, but it can be. But even just those interpersonal boundaries where, you can just share a little bit, and then if they don't take it well, that doesn't also have to be your crisis. Like, other people are allowed to have their experience and their feelings. And one way that we can really honor other people in their adulthood is by letting them have their own feelings. I think another thing to think about is like just checking motives before you do it, and checking trauma reaction. Because if you're in a reaction and you kind of want to like dig a little, that's probably not the time to have this discussion. So just make sure you're grounded, centered, breathe, make sure you're in your functional adult, and then you can have kind of a less, activating exchange about the work that's been done at APN. I hear a lot from people that it's very hard to capture in a phrase or two what gets done in thorough, deep treatment. And sometimes that's okay. Like, not everybody needs to know. It's your experience and yours and your cohorts. And that's special, I think. So it can be brief. I don't know. I might not have answered that well, but it's a hard one. It's a good one though.
I agree. I mean, sometimes, answering the questions, like you said, the motives, like, why am I, am I answering this to, ego, right? Pound the chest, look at me, look how great I'm doing, or stick it to somebody, right? And so again, as long as you're doing your work prior and you're able to self-reflect and look internally and see why and what's going on, and if you got good motives and you're going for a good purpose, then you can have that talk, but say what you're comfortable saying. Yeah, I agree 1,000%. All right, we're running out of time. Any more questions? I saw one other one about a book about Schwartz's new book. I don't know if you know Dr. Schwartz's newest book. Does he have one, Lana? Since you're if you don't know, you can Google it.
He does. I think he does.
Checking the bookshelf. Here we go.
We just happened to be in my office. I don't actually think I have it. I don't. I think he does though, and I haven't read it, but he's got a lot of good ideas. So I would suggest checking it out. I will too.
This isn't a question, but somebody wrote, super helpful. My brother actually told me about his own deep childhood trauma when I got back from APN, when he asked me to lunch and wanted to hear about my APN experience. So like, again, that's sometimes like you'll run into people when they know that you're healthy or you've worked on yourself. And then, people just want to talk to you about stuff. You know what I mean? Because like, because, hey, everyone puts the facade up like everything's great, but usually everything's not great. So when they know that you've done something to work on yourself and get healthier, but let me shut up and let Lana go again. I think we just got another question, but go ahead, Lana.
No, I think that, yeah, absolutely. That's great. I mean, the idea here is that we want to destigmatize this stuff. I mean, trauma from when we're looking at even, war trauma, to childhood trauma, to sexual assault, all this stuff is spent a lot of time in the closet and a lot of time being stigmatized. Shell shock was like a shameful word back in World War I, World War II era. And, now we've come so far, but there still is, it's still hard. People feel like it's, admitting some kind of weakness, when in actuality, opening the door and opening the box and getting right down to it is incredible strength, but people just don't see it that way yet. So coming home with this, new view is huge. And I think it can help destigmatize. One more thing, and then we'll look at the other question. But I tell people all the time when they're leaving, that we're walking out of treatment into a world full of untreated people. And untreated people and sometimes just aren't able to see things the way we do. And so our gift can be, the attraction rather than promotion. Like our gift can be, here's how it worked for me. And if that looks interesting, then check it out.
Well, I'll give Lana a quick trauma reaction. What we would joke about in staff meetings for years is when something happened, I would say like, oh, what a gift. When someone really like pissed me off or did something crazy, I'd say, what a gift that this person's letting me work on patience, tolerance, and love and understanding. And like,
Right.
it was always the joke, like, oh, what a gift. So when something obnoxious happened, right? But in the same breath, like when I go out into the world, like Lana said, I'm going to run into a lot of gifts, and I can be like, oh, all these people are idiots. Or I could say like, oh my God, what a gift. Because I get to work on my reactions to theirs, kind of deal.
Heads are falling off.
Exactly. All right. So the last comment was just like, hey, great job, guys. So I didn't see a question. Let me just give another quick check. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This was great. All right, let's check this one more time. Newest shorts book is No Bad Parts. Thank you. I'm sure that person was in Lana's group with all that trauma with knowing who Schwartz is and talking about the book.
Oh, you were saying that No Bad Parts is his new book. I get it. Sorry. I missed that. Yes. Awesome. I'll check it out. Yeah. It sounds like him. Yeah.
All right. Well, so like I said, and if you have a question that you didn't feel comfortable asking now, obviously you can email me. If you can email Lana. If you don't have Lana's email address, you can send it to me and I can forward it to her. And if there's a question you just didn't feel comfortable asking, or if you think of a question tomorrow morning, or tonight, just let me know. Right. And again, this is recorded. So we'll be able to send this out. Somebody asked, can we make the slides available? I'll talk to Lana offline, but I'm sure we can, and I can forward it to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But the Alumni Association is putting a lot of new stuff on, so keep checking your emails. But more importantly, shout out to Lana for coming on here and giving us this talk, and we're super grateful. If we could see everybody, we'd all be clapping, tipping our caps. Great job, Lana. And again, thank you for everyone that came to the webinars. If this was your first one, awesome. If you came to all three, awesome. We just want to offer you guys as much support as possible, and we'll do these again at some point in the future. Is there a portal for alumni? Again, I'm gonna call the person that just asked that. I'm gonna call you tomorrow. We'll touch base about all alumni information. But again, we want to give a shout out to everyone who came. Thank you so much for the people that put it on. And Lana, again, thank you.
I want to say thanks also to everybody who showed up. It takes time out of your day. And I just love seeing, there's over 20 people in this. Like, I just love seeing you guys being so active in the alumni stuff. It's huge and it means a lot and it says a lot. So awesome, guys.
It's awesome. Yeah, you guys are great. Yeah, we were at, I think, 31 at one point. So it was, it spiked up in the middle, which is great. So again, we're done. Thank you so much. And next Wednesday, we'll be back to our normal Zoom call, which is Wednesday night at 6:30 Eastern, 4:30 Mountain. So if you're looking for that information, if you haven't had it, reach out to me and I'll give it to you. But I'll send out an email to my alumni list with all of the information. Again, Lana, thank you. You're the best. And I think we're done. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.